The twin suns of Urindor rose together over the crystalline plains, spilling liquid gold light across the spire-like towers of the royal palace. Princess Lysara moved through the halls with a grace that seemed choreographed by the very stars themselves, her pale, luminous skin glowing softly against the iridescent floors, her long ears twitching slightly at the faintest hum of the palace energy fields. Suitors had begun arriving early that morning, as they always did, each more extravagant than the last, each convinced that today would be the day they captured her attention. The first was a warrior with cybernetic arms gleaming like polished meteorite. He attempted to demonstrate his strength by lifting a levitating boulder the size of a speeder car, only to accidentally launch it across the hall, where it narrowly missed a hovering diplomat who yelped, flailed, and then somehow managed to land gracefully on a floating chair. Lysara's lips twitched, almost a smile, though she maintained the regal composure that had driven her reputation across galaxies. The next entrant was a diplomatic envoy from a nearby star system, who insisted on delivering a speech while perched atop a hover platform that refused to stabilize. Every time he tried to gesture dramatically, the platform spun like a corkscrew, sending him careening into a holographic map of interstellar trade routes. Lysara suppressed a chuckle, her long ears flicking in amusement, noting that the man's face had gone from confident to crimson in the span of 3 awkward pirouettes. Even the court's stoic advisors were forced to glance at one another, some raising invisible eyebrows behind masks that displayed calculated neutrality. Lysara found their discomfort nearly as entertaining as the envoy's eventual, tangled bow. A prince from a neighboring system entered next, trailing glittering banners and a personal robot orchestra programmed to play heroic fanfares. He tried to impress her by performing a zero-gravity spin on the palace terrace. The music, however, misfired, producing a cacophony that sounded like a chorus of hyperactive birds crossed with malfunctioning starship engines. Lysara's suppressed laughter nearly escaped, and she caught herself tapping one finger to the rhythm, amused at the absurdity of it all. None of them seemed to realize that their efforts, while technically impressive, lacked a crucial element: authenticity. She could feel the distance between their polished displays and something real, something that could resonate with her own spirit. She drifted down a corridor lined with energy conduits, her fingers brushing the surface as they glowed faintly, sending ripples across the polished floor. Her eyes followed the suitors' frantic maneuvers, and she whispered under her breath to herself, a small quip about each one, light enough to amuse but not enough to offend. "Lift the boulder and hope it misses the diplomat," she murmured, voice laced with wry humor. "Spin like a planet, fall like a meteorite." She shook her head, her long hair shimmering like silver waves in the sunlight, enjoying the theater of pomp and vanity. The palace itself seemed to hum in agreement, as if the walls had memorized the patterns of centuries of failed attempts to sway her heart. As the day wore on, Lysara allowed herself moments of genuine amusement, teasing each suitor with subtle gestures and playful glances. Her laughter, light and musical, wove through the corridors, cutting through the tension that often came with the weight of royalty. It was clear that she was not interested in wealth, power, or dazzling skill. She wanted something unpredictable, something real. She had yet to encounter it, but the hum of the palace and the endless spectacle of floundering suitors reminded her that sometimes the universe has a sense of humor just as sharp as her own. The sun's twin rays shifted across the floors, casting long golden reflections, and she paused to watch the chaos unfold, her lips curving in quiet amusement, knowing that this day, like all others, would end with her heart untouched but her spirits slightly lifted. The energy of the palace hummed on, carrying the echoes of clumsy gestures, sparkling fanfares, and levitating mishaps. Lysara moved on, already curious to see who, if anyone, could break the monotony of perfection, who might be bold enough to challenge the absurd choreography of her life with something genuine, something unpolished, and perhaps, just perhaps, something entirely human. The day continued to hum with a peculiar rhythm, as if the palace itself had decided to treat the suitors as living entertainment rather than serious contenders. Princess Lysara floated through the crystal-lined halls with effortless elegance, her long ears twitching faintly at the distant echoes of flustered speeches and misfired levitation platforms. A group of diplomats had gathered in the central atrium, attempting to outwit one another with clever phrases about trade agreements and interstellar alliances, while Lysara leaned casually against a pillar, one hand tracing idle patterns in the air that left luminous trails flickering like stardust. One particularly ambitious envoy decided that wit, rather than strength or grandeur, would win her favor. He attempted a pun about quantum flux and temporal diplomacy, only to realize halfway through that he had misquoted a fundamental law of physics. The crowd winced, the hovering platforms shuddered, and Lysara's suppressed chuckle escaped in a delicate ripple, her long ears flicking like the tails of curious comets. The man's face went from confident to crimson in the span of 2 sentences, and he bowed so deeply that one of the hovering assistants had to scoop him back upright before he collided with a kinetic art installation. Lysara whispered to herself, graceful as a falling star, with the accuracy of a misprogrammed drone, and the corners of her lips lifted, amused beyond measure. The next candidate, a warrior from the icy rings of Cryon, strode in with arms that glowed faintly with nanotech enhancements. He flexed, producing sparks that ignited mini-light shows along the palace walls. Yet, when he attempted a demonstration of martial skill, he underestimated the anti-gravity fields of the central hall and flipped upside down, spinning helplessly like a poorly calibrated satellite. The audience gasped, some hid smiles behind polite masks, and Lysara's laugh rang out, bright and musical, teasing without cruelty. She flicked a hand toward him. Perhaps try orbiting a little slower, dear warrior, and the man blinked in embarrassment, recovering as best he could, while the palace drones corrected his trajectory with quiet whirring. Even the royal advisors, normally the epitome of stoic composure, exchanged amused glances, some shaking invisible heads as if the sheer absurdity of the day required collective acknowledgement. Lysara allowed herself a rare moment of levity, weaving humor into the rigid tapestries of ceremony, watching the chaos unfold like a living constellation of mistakes. She had long ago decided that suitors were rarely what they appeared to be, and that power, wealth, or impressive displays of skill were often masks for insecurity. Today, the masks slipped spectacularly, and she reveled in the spectacle. Between these grand failures, Lysara wandered into the palace library, a vast chamber of floating books and holographic star charts, and allowed herself to ponder in peace. One of the younger suitors had tried to impress her by juggling miniature black holes in zero gravity, which had led to an impromptu evacuation of half the staff and a few singed robes. Lysara's amusement was tempered by a faint sigh. She longed for someone who could move through the palace with genuine curiosity, someone who could laugh at themselves without needing to impress, someone who could navigate the absurdity as naturally as she did. The afternoon sun dipped lower, twin rays scattering across the hall, and Lysara paused to watch a small robotic assistant chase after a rolling orb, bumping into a diplomat's heels and sending him tumbling into a fountain. She laughed, light and unrestrained, her long ears quivering in delight, and whispered, "Perhaps the universe will finally send me someone, human enough to make all this fun worth it." The day stretched on, playful yet tense, a canvas of failed elegance and charming chaos, leaving her with a growing sense that something, or someone, entirely unexpected might soon appear to disrupt the orchestrated spectacle of her life, in ways that no display of wealth, technology, or power ever could. The day had barely begun to soften into the twin suns, late gold, when a new presence arrived at the palace. A human named Ethan, whose ship trundled clumsily across the landing platform, whistling an unintentionally cheerful tune from its ventilation system. The palace guards, unused to anything that wasn't at least faintly shimmering with nanotech polish, raised eyebrows so high they nearly brushed the ceiling. Lysara, curious but maintaining her usual serene poise, leaned lightly against the railing of a balcony, her long ears flicking with subtle amusement at the unusual noises emanating from the visitor's craft. Ethan stumbled as he exited the vessel, tripping over the magnetic field that stabilized the landing pad, arms flailing in a comical imitation of zero-gravity grace. One of the hovering courtiers whispered, "He might be dangerous," while another muttered, "or just profoundly clumsy." Lysara's lips quirked in a smile that she knew could melt icy worlds. There was something entirely unpretentious about him, something that didn't demand awe or obedience. He dusted himself off, straightened a collar that didn't really need straightening, and looked around with wide-eyed fascination, as if the palace itself were a living creature rather than a monument of protocol and glass. He approached the main atrium, where the day's parade of suitors had left a trail of minor chaos. Overturned levitation platforms, a few scorched robes, and a holographic map that still flickered in protest from the juggling of miniature black holes earlier. Ethan's gaze flitted from one absurdity to the next, and instead of looking intimidated, he chuckled. A human sound, warm and unrefined, bouncing against the crystalline walls. "I suppose someone forgot to warn me about the floating furniture," he said, voice slightly breathless from dodging a wayward orb. Lysara, from her balcony, allowed herself a small laugh, soft and melodic, her long ears twitching as if listening for the humor woven into the universe itself. When he finally met her gaze, Lysara felt an unfamiliar flicker of curiosity, something more tangible than amusement. He inclined his head with a polite, tentative respect, and there was no bowing so deep it risked injury, no exaggerated gestures of grandeur. Just a human man, present in the moment, willing to navigate the strange physics and social absurdities of her world without pretense. "Hello," he said simply, eyes bright with genuine interest. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." His tone carried no arrogance, no need to impress, and for the first time that day, Lysara felt a quiet intrigue stir in her chest. The palace staff, uncertain how to respond, hovered in suspense. Even the court drones, programmed to react to protocol breaches, paused mid-hover, seemingly considering whether to correct the human or allow him to continue. Ethan, undeterred, wandered further into the hall, bending down to help an older envoy right himself after a minor collision with a floating holographic display. "I'm Ethan," he said, straightening, and gave a sheepish grin. "I've never been very coordinated with high-tech interiors." Lysara's smile widened imperceptibly. She descended from the balcony in slow, deliberate steps, silver hair brushing the floor like a comet's tail, her long ears angled to catch every nuance. "Coordination," she murmured, voice teasing, "is overrated, especially when it comes with charm." Ethan blinked, taken aback for only a fraction of a second before a sheepish laugh escaped him, and in that moment, Lysara realized she had never encountered someone who seemed so unaffected by the pomp and spectacle that usually defined her world. He didn't try to impress her with feats of strength or grandiose statements about distant alliances. He merely existed, curious, earnest, a touch clumsy, yet entirely present, and that presence was far more magnetic than the brilliance of any other suitor who had crossed her path. For the first time in countless cycles, Lysara felt the rigid constellations of her carefully orchestrated life shift slightly, allowing space for something unpredictable to enter. A ripple of anticipation, tinted with amusement and perhaps something even more dangerous. Intrigue. She tilted her head, long ears quivering with unspoken amusement, and said lightly, "Well, human, let's see if you survive the palace without losing your dignity, or at least your sense of humor." Ethan grinned, and the sound of it, warm and real, echoed through the crystalline corridors like a promise of chaos worth exploring. Lysara led him into the labyrinthine heart of the palace, where the walls themselves seemed to shift, illuminated by soft waves of light that pulsed like breathing stars. Ethan followed, stepping cautiously over a section of floor that flickered in and out of existence as if testing his balance, while Lysara drifted ahead, her long ears flicking in anticipation, silver hair catching the ambient glow. She had devised a test, not cruel but entertaining, a series of playful trials that had unseated every previous suitor. It was not strength she sought, nor flashy skill, but the spark of adaptability, of genuine courage and humor in the face of absurdity. The first challenge was a corridor lined with levitating platforms that moved in unpredictable patterns, some spinning gently, others darting sharply to the side. Past suitors had tripped, flailed, and cursed. Lysara herself had watched with quiet amusement as one diplomat's elegant robe snagged on a platform, spinning him into a wall of floating holograms depicting Urindor's historical victories. Ethan, however, paused for only a second, muttering under his breath, "Well, this is new," before stepping forward, arms out, shifting his weight like a tightrope walker with a grin. A low chuckle escaped him as he almost collided with a floating orb, catching it instinctively and tossing it back into its programmed orbit. Lysara's lips curved in delight, her laughter ringing softly through the corridor like chimes. The next trial involved a series of holographic illusions. Creatures from distant galaxies, some monstrous, some absurdly cute, emerging from thin air to block the path. Previous suitors had panicked, swinging arms, shouting orders, or backing away. Ethan, by contrast, paused to inspect the projections, poking one gently with a gloved finger and grinning. "Not real," he said simply, then stepped lightly around a flickering pseudobeast, muttering jokes under his breath that made Lysara snort quietly behind him. "You're talking to a hologram of a three-headed space bunny, and you're joking?" She murmured, amused. "Yes," he replied. "Why panic when it might just want a snack?" The absurdity of his calmness, his irrepressible humor in the face of a palace designed to terrify, drew an uncharacteristic flush of warmth to her cheeks. A narrow bridge of suspended light was the final obstacle, glowing faintly over a simulated chasm that stretched into shimmering void. The edges pulsed as if daring travelers to slip. Ethan's first step made him wobble dangerously, and he uttered a human expletive under his breath, drawing another suppressed laugh from Lysara. With a quick adjustment of stance and a sheepish grin, he crossed, muttering, "Gravity is overrated anyway." She admired the blend of human stubbornness and adaptive thinking, realizing that his imperfections, his missteps, his jokes, his instinctive problem-solving, were exactly the qualities that no perfect suitor could ever display. By the time they reached the end of the labyrinth, Lysara found herself genuinely laughing for the first time in a long while. The palace, usually a place of rigid ceremony and tense displays, had become a playground of light, motion, and human unpredictability. Ethan looked around, grinning sheepishly at her. "So, did I pass?" he asked, breathless but entirely unflustered. She studied him, eyes gleaming with amusement, and something else she hadn't expected, recognition of a spark that felt rare and alive. "You survived better than I anticipated," she said, teasing, "and you didn't even complain once about the three-headed bunnies or floating floors. That is impressive." He shrugged, scratching the back of his head. "I mean, I can complain later. Right now, I'm just trying not to break anything or myself." Lysara's laughter rang out, clear and musical, echoing through the corridors like wind across crystalline plains. For the first time, she felt her walls loosen, her amusement entwined with intrigue, and a sense of curiosity that bordered on anticipation. Perhaps this human, awkward, genuine, and unexpectedly resourceful was unlike any she had ever met. And perhaps, just perhaps, he was the beginning of something unpredictable enough to crack the rigid constellations of her carefully ordered world. By the next morning, the palace hummed with a quiet chaos unlike any Lysara had ever witnessed. Word of the humans' unusual composure in the labyrinth had spread like a trail of sparks across Urindor's halls, leaving courtiers whispering and floating platforms buzzing with the latest gossip. Lysara moved among them with her usual grace, but there was a subtle shift in her demeanor. A playful gleam in her eyes, a lightness in her steps, as if the palace itself had grown brighter with his presence. Ethan, seemingly oblivious to the attention he had garnered, wandered into the atrium carrying a small tray of interstellar pastries he had scavenged from the kitchen, fumbling slightly with zero-gravity utensils. One pastry escaped orbit and floated past a hovering noble, who lunged theatrically, only to miss completely and nearly tip a hovering tea service onto the floor. Ethan flailed, catching the pastry with a grin, muttering, "I swear I didn't plan that." And the princess's laughter rang out like chimes through the atrium, drawing curious glances from all assembled. Her long ears twitched in amusement, silver hair catching the twin suns' glow, and she shook her head, marveling at the humans' improbable combination of clumsiness and charm. The court, meanwhile, attempted to maintain decorum, though every whispered conversation carried undertones of astonishment and mild panic. "Has she changed?" one advisor murmured as he adjusted the projection of historical alliances. "She's laughing," another whispered back, voice tinged with disbelief. They watched as Lysara hovered near Ethan, teasing him gently as he tripped over a floating holographic display and apologized with a humor that was entirely unexpected. The princess's smile, the way she tilted her head and let her laughter ripple through the space, sent waves of murmured speculation among the courtiers. No suitor before him had ever earned such attention simply by being human, awkward, and real. Ethan, oblivious to the court's judgment, asked questions with a curious, unpretentious fascination, poking at holographic star charts and joking about the apparent inefficiency of palace transport corridors. I mean, gravity-altered corridors make sense if you want exercise, but could we maybe not? He quipped, and the guards snorted quietly behind hovering screens. Lysara's amusement deepened. She found herself leaning closer to hear his commentary, exchanging subtle glances that carried more meaning than any carefully rehearsed bow or scripted line of diplomacy. He did not attempt to impress her with feats of strength or eloquence. He simply engaged with her world, marveling at its quirks and laughing at his own missteps. The afternoon brought another spectacle. A ceremonial robot orchestra, programmed to play solemn fanfares, malfunctioned when a stray pastry collided with a kinetic conductor, producing a cacophony that sounded like an interstellar cat choir with laser accompaniment. Ethan, without missing a beat, mimicked the rhythm of the choir with his own clumsy taps, turning the accident into an impromptu performance. Lysara clapped, long ears flicking in delight, her laughter ringing through the atrium. Even the normally stern royal advisors allowed themselves small smiles, understanding that the human's influence was reshaping the palace atmosphere in ways no suitor had ever managed. By evening, it was clear to all that Lysara's attention was no longer lightly entertained curiosity. Her gaze lingered on Ethan with an intensity tempered by amusement, her playful teasing a visible thread of growing fascination. She invited him to explore the palace gardens, where zero-gravity fountains shimmered like liquid stars, and together they laughed over the bizarre physics of floating flora, their footsteps, or lack thereof, intertwining with levitating blossoms. She marveled at how he navigated her world without pretense, how he transformed the rigid choreography of courtly display into something organic and joyful. As the twin suns dipped lower, casting long, golden shadows across the crystalline terraces, Lysara realized something she had not in decades of suitor scrutiny. For the first time, she was captivated not by perfection or display, but by someone real. Someone unpolished, unexpected, and entirely human. And in that moment, she allowed herself a tiny, rebellious thought, one that fluttered at the edges of her heart like a comet about to break orbit, that perhaps this human might be the one capable of piercing the constellations of her carefully orchestrated life. The twin suns had barely touched the horizon when the alarm bells echoed through the palace, a series of harmonic tones that twisted with urgency. A minor asteroid storm, unusually concentrated, had veered into the orbital path near the palace's protective shields. The floating terraces quivered slightly, and holographic displays flickered with the approaching debris, painting the hallways in shifting blue and gold light. Lysara, normally unflappable, arched a delicate eyebrow, a smirk playing at her lips despite the impending chaos. "Looks like our little human friend might get a proper test after all," she murmured, her long ears flicking toward the control panels as she watched the suitors and court staff scramble. Ethan, who had been examining a hovering plant that inexplicably rotated on its own axis, looked up and blinked. "Asteroids? Right now?" he said, voice carrying both surprise and amusement. His expression didn't falter. Instead, he grinned, adjusting the sleeve of his slightly singed jacket from an earlier misadventure. Lysara, leaning against a nearby railing, allowed herself a laugh, quiet but musical. "Yes, and if you survive this, you might earn permanent immunity from..." The first test was immediate. A small fragment of asteroid had breached the outer shield, striking one of the palace's floating gardens and knocking several hovering flora into erratic motion. Lysara watched with a mixture of amusement and curiosity as Ethan assessed the situation, crouching to stabilize a tilting, levitating walkway while joking. "Gravity really doesn't like me today, does it?" One of the suitors, a robotic-enhanced prince, tried to intervene with a flourish of laser blades and nanotech cables, only to ricochet off the walls in a spectacularly clumsy spin. Ethan's hands moved with intuitive precision, grabbing a displaced energy tether and rerouting it with a lopsided, human improvisation that actually worked. Lysara's laughter rang out again, her silver hair catching the twin sun's reflection and even the palace drones seemed to hover in admiration at his unexpected skill. Another fragment struck the central atrium, sending a holographic fountain spinning into chaotic loops. Ethan, without hesitation, dashed forward, catching one of the floating children who had been watching in terror, cradling him in his arms with a sheepish grin. "Sorry, kiddo, didn't plan a space-themed roller coaster today," he quipped, and Lysara's laugh was uncontrollable this time, long ears flicking with delight. She realized then that courage, like humor, was not in perfect execution, but in action, in the willingness to step forward despite risk, in the playful improvisation that defied fear and expectation. The final test came when a particularly large fragment, glittering with the energy of trapped starlight, threatened to shatter the palace's observation dome. Ethan, without pause, calculated a trajectory with the help of rudimentary hand gestures and instinctive problem-solving. He moved as if dancing with chaos itself, dodging floating shards, stabilizing energy fields, and finally, with a lopsided grin, diverting the fragment harmlessly into the sky, where it exploded in harmless sparks, like a tiny artificial supernova. Lysara, floating nearby, felt her heart lurch in admiration and amusement simultaneously. She had witnessed countless demonstrations of strength and precision in her life, yet none had carried the warmth, courage, and unpredictability that this human embodied. When the palace had settled, the children returned to their games, the plants resumed their gentle rotations, and the holograms flickered back to serenity, Lysara turned to him with an intensity she could no longer disguise. Her long ears quivered slightly, silver hair cascading around her shoulders. "Well," she said lightly, teasing yet unmistakably sincere, "that was impressive. Not perfect, but brilliant in its own human way." Ethan blinked, sheepish but proud, and she laughed, the sound like chimes against crystalline walls. In that laughter was a realization, a ripple of something unstoppable forming between them. She stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried the weight of galaxies, yet still playful. "I want him." The words floated through the golden light, teasing and irrevocable, as if the twin suns themselves had conspired to witness the moment. Around them, the palace hummed, the floating terraces shimmered, and the universe seemed to pause just long enough to acknowledge that a human, with his clumsy bravery and irrepressible humor, had finally pierced the constellation of her heart. The twin suns had dipped low, spilling molten gold light across the crystalline terraces, and the palace of Urindor seemed almost to sigh in contentment after days of chaos, laughter, and unexpected turns. Lysara leaned against the railing of the main balcony, silver hair brushing lightly against her shoulders, long ears angled toward the warm breeze. She watched Ethan as he moved among the floating gardens, adjusting levitating plants that tilted too sharply and laughing at his own clumsy miscalculations. The human, who had stumbled into her world like a comet with unpredictable orbit, had become its brightest and most unpredictable star. The court, still buzzing with murmurs about the astonishing events of recent days, had begun to accept the unprecedented. Diplomats and suitors who had once believed in rigid protocol now wandered carefully, unsure whether to bow, tiptoe, or simply smile. Lysara found herself enjoying their discomfort, teasing gently from afar while allowing herself the freedom to follow her own heart. She realized that the weight of expectation, of perfection and ceremony, had been lifted in the presence of someone who refused to play by those rules. Ethan's humor, courage, and unapologetic humanity had reshaped the palace into a place of living joy, a place where mistakes could be delightful and bravery could be imperfect yet profound. Ethan approached, carrying a small, hovering tray of sweets from the royal kitchens, one pastry wobbling precariously on the edge. "I swear these have a mind of their own," he said with a grin, balancing the tray with more luck than skill. Lysara tilted her head, her long ears flicking in amusement. "They probably do," she replied lightly, her voice teasing. "And yet somehow you manage to command obedience without even trying." He laughed, setting the tray on a stable surface, and together they sampled the confections, floating slightly above the terraces to account for the low-gravity effects. The palace, finally at ease, had resumed its usual rhythm, but with subtle changes. Floating corridors hummed softer, drones moved with a slightly more relaxed efficiency, and the once stern advisors now allowed themselves small smiles, often catching glimpses of Lysara and Ethan laughing together. The princess, once untouchable in her elegance and perfection, felt the walls around her heart dissolve. She discovered that joy could be spontaneous, bravery could be humble, and connection could bridge worlds without the need for grandeur or spectacle. She had been tested, entertained, and ultimately transformed, not by displays of wealth or power, but by the simple, irrepressible authenticity of someone from another star. They wandered to the observation deck as the twin suns kissed the horizon, the sky awash in liquid gold and soft violet, and looked out over the glimmering plains of Urindor. Ethan gestured at a distant floating waterfall, joking, "Do you think anyone ever tries to slide down that thing?" Lysera laughed, her long ears quivering with delight. "I suspect they have," she said, teasing, "and likely regretted it in the most spectacular fashion." He chuckled, shaking his head, and for the first time she saw a reflection of herself in his amused, unguarded gaze, a mirror not of perfection, but of joy and courage lightly tempered by human imperfection. In that moment, Lysara realized the full depth of the journey she had undergone. She had spent cycles rejecting suitors for their polish, their displays, their predictable brilliance, but she had never truly known the value of unpredictability, humor, and the gentle courage that came with authenticity. Ethan, with his awkward bravery, playful mistakes, and irrepressible humanity, had shifted her world in ways no ceremony or power could achieve. She leaned closer, brushing a fingertip along the edge of his sleeve, her silver hair catching the last rays of the suns, and whispered, "I never expected this." "You," he smiled, taking her hand, and she laughed softly, feeling the warmth ripple through her chest. As twilight settled across the palace, the floating gardens glimmered with bioluminescent light, and the twin suns faded into the horizon, casting long, golden reflections over the crystal floors. The chaos of the past days had transformed into a rhythm of laughter and gentle connection. In that moment, Lysara realized the full depth of the journey she had undergone. She had spent cycles rejecting suitors for their polish, their displays, their predictable brilliance, but she had never truly known the value of unpredictability, humor, and the gentle courage that came with authenticity. Ethan, with his awkward bravery, playful mistakes, and irrepressible humanity, had shifted her world in ways no ceremony or power could achieve. She leaned closer, brushing a fingertip along the edge of his sleeve, her silver hair catching the last rays of the suns, and whispered, "I never expected this." "You," he smiled, taking her hand, and she laughed softly, feeling the warmth ripple through her chest. As twilight settled across the palace, the floating gardens glimmered with bioluminescent light, and the twin suns faded into the horizon, casting long, golden reflections over the crystal floors. The chaos of the past days had transformed into a rhythm of laughter and gentle connection. Lysara, once untouchable, now stood beside a human who had taught her that love and joy could not be demanded, but were discovered in courage, humor, and presence. Together, they looked out at the galaxy beyond, ready to explore its wonders hand in hand, knowing that the constellations of her life had shifted forever. And this time, she would follow the unpredictable light of the heart rather than the rigid glow of expectation. The palace hummed softly around them, the floating terraces shimmered, and Lysara felt a profound, unshakable certainty. She had found not a perfect suitor, but someone extraordinary in his imperfection, and in doing so, she had discovered a version of herself she had never known, radiant,